Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy channel. Today I want to speak about the red heifer and the fate of the world. You may not realize this, but today the Temple Institute calls today Parashat Pada. And this is the day that they read passages in the Old Testament about the red heifer. Have you ever heard of red heifers? What could they have to do with the fate of the world? Well, a heifer is a young cow, female, over a year of age that hasn't had any calves. And cows are generally considered heifers after age 6 months, sometimes a year or whatever. And a red heifer is one that's got a particular type of color. It's not really red, it's more like a brownish red, more brown I think than red. But anyway, various Jews believe that God is going to provide a red heifer just before the time that the Messiah will arise. Some farmers are raising cattle in the hope that one of them will be a red heifer. Now, a few years ago, it claimed that a red heifer was being raised in the United States, and etc. But then later they decided that no, that heifer wasn't a valid one. There were other ones in the past that the Temple Institute thought might be the right one, and then later they decided no, this was not it. But I got a newsletter from the Temple Institute yesterday, and it says, potential red heifers on the way. This week, rabbis from the Temple Institute paid a visit to a cattle ranch here in Israel, where 5 red Angus cows are each entering the final month of their pregnancy. The 5 cows are part of the Temple Institute's program to raise a red heifer in Israel. The Institute's been working closely with local cattle growers in an effort to produce a red heifer candidate. Longtime followers of the Temple Institute know well that the Institute spent decades searching for the requirements for the ordinance of the red heifer as described in Numbers 19, which will be read in synagogues today, as well as the viability of raising a red heifer. Throughout the years, we've seen potential ones being grown around the world or born around the world, as well as in Israel. And one day, I believe that it's likely the Jews will say it's acceptable. Now, why do they want this? Well, one of the reasons they want this is they believe that they need to do this before they can do sacrifices. Now, while they want a red heifer, I don't believe they absolutely think they have to have them. But essentially, the Temple Institute believes that the fate of the world depends on a red heifer being found and then sacrificed. Now, the Old Testament talks about animal sacrifices, and we don't have them currently. Back in 2009, I warned that one day there were going to be sacrifices in Israel, and it might be perceived as a terrible crime by the rest of the world. And interestingly, at least to me, in 2014, the government of India banned religious animal sacrifices as barbaric. Now in Israel, they're not banned as barbaric. They are banned temporarily banned, it's been a long permanent temporary ban, basically because of the political situation over there. But the time is going to come when animal sacrifices will be resumed. How do we know that? Well, if we go to the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 27, I'm going to read this from the New King James Version of the Bible. It says, "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering." So, for the sacrifice and offerings to end, the sacrifices have to be implemented. Now let's go to Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. It says, "And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortresses. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation." Now he who's going to stop this is the king of the north of Daniel chapter 11, who's called the beast of the sea in Revelation chapter 13, 1 through 10. I find it interesting that you see prophecy that this king of the north is going to stop this. And you might point to the decision, for example, by the government of India to ban sacrifices. Interestingly, there's a couple of Catholic prophecies that I'd like to refer to. One is by Abbot Herman of Lenin, who died in 1300. He said, "Toward the end of the world, the Israel will commit a terrible crime for which it will suffer death." And then we've got another one from a Catholic priest who wrote, "Toward the end of the world, the Jews are to commit some atrocious crime for which they are greatly persecuted. The great monarch, this lion monarch, together with the great pope or angelic pastor, shall appear after socialism." Now, what's all that got to do with any of this kind of stuff? The king of the north that the Bible warns against sounds a lot like the great monarch that certain Catholic writers have looked forward to. Not all Catholic writers. Some say don't do this because this is dangerous, and they're correct on that part. Anyway, so we've got some prophecy the Jews are going to do something that's going to be considered a terrible crime and upset the world. And we also see that after socialism, some leader's going to rise. It could be perceived that sometime after the fall of communism, Eastern Europe, for example, that's when this leader's supposed to arrive. So we may be getting closer and closer to this. And it could be the great crime that the Jews are to commit could have to do with all destruction of perhaps Damascus, but it also, or something like that, or something in Iran, but it also could have to do with this idea of sacrifices, doing animal sacrifices, which will probably not be politically correct in most of the rest of the world. Now, as far as the red heifer goes, I'd like to go to Numbers chapter 19 and read what it says. I know it's a lot to read, but I'm going to start in verse 1. I'll go through verse 10. You can follow along if you'd like. "Now the Lord, or eternal Yahweh, spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Eternal has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they may bring you a red heifer without blemish, in which there is no defect, on which a yoke has never come." Now let me just stop here. It just says it's without blemish. Lately, the Temple Institute's basically said couldn't have any hairs or too many hairs that are not red. Anyway, getting back to verse 3. "You shall give it to Eleazar the priest, that he may take it outside the camp, and it may be slaughtered before him. And the Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger, and sprinkle some of its blood 7 times directly on the tabernacle of the meeting. Then the heifer shall be burned in the sight, its hide, its flesh, its blood, and its offal shall be burned. And the priest shall take the cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet and cast it in the midst of the fire, burning the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes, he shall bathe in water, and afterwards he'll come into the camp, and the priest shall be unclean until the evening. And the one who burns it shall wash his clothes in water, bathe in water, and shall be unclean until the evening. Then a man who is clean shall gather up all the ashes of the heifer, store them outside the camp in a clean place, and they shall be kept for the congregation of Israel for the water of purification. It is purifying from sin. And the one who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. It shall be a statute forever to the children of Israel and to the stranger who dwells among them." Now, some Jews have interpreted this to mean that they have to have a red heifer in order for sacrifices to be resumed. It can be implied, but that doesn't directly say that. Furthermore, certain Jews, like the Temple Institute, have added non-biblical requirements of this 10th red heifer, which is, from a Christian perspective, is certainly not needed. But humanly, it might be considered necessary for the Jews to do sacrifices. Now, that being said, when I was in Israel, and I went to the Temple Institute, and I met with people there, and I asked the man there, "Do you guys have to have, for example, a temple in order to do sacrifices?" "No, we've got an altar here already." One of our sons was there a month beforehand and was told that they could do the sacrifices within hours. The reason I mention that is, therefore, even the Temple Institute doesn't think that to do any sacrifices they have to have a red heifer, but they prefer to have one. And I kind of wonder if perhaps, because they don't think it's time yet for some of these sacrifices, that they've declared that various heifers that they found weren't quite the way they should be. Now, I want to go to Daniel chapter 12, verses 9 through 12. Some Jews believe that the book of Daniel and Isaiah tell about the future of a red heifer, but they don't actually specify one. For example, Daniel 12, verse 9. And he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed and sealed to the times of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. but the wise shall understand. And from the time the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to 1,335 days. Some Jews tie the purification in verse 10 with sacrifices in verse 11. Yet, in those passages in the Hebrew, it doesn't say anything about a red heifer. So sometimes some have tied it into Isaiah 1 verse 18. So let me read that. Come now, let us reason together, says the Eternal. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though your sins are red like crimson, they shall be as wool. Some of the Jews tie the burning of scarlet in Numbers 9:6 to this. And while sin can be like scarlet, the Bible is not saying this related to a red heifer. It's a call from God to repent. And Christians do this without a heifer, because it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats can take away sin, as it says in Hebrews 10:4. Jesus takes away sin, as it says in John 1:36. Now I want to read from the book of Hebrews from the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 9, starting verse 11. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not of the blood of goats and calves, but his own blood. He entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So Christians certainly don't need a heifer, but the Jews who reject the sacrifice of Jesus, many of them, or some of them, think that they do. Now, the Jews have a bunch of traditions about red heifers. In their Mishnah, it's claimed that Moses prepared the first one, Ezra prepared the second, and 5 were after Ezra. Supposedly, there have only been 9 properly prepared ones, and a 10th one is needed. Now, some Church of God groups, including one I was once part of, say you have to have a red heifer for the end to come. And there might be one, but I wouldn't go out on a limb and say scripturally that that's required. Now, the Temple Institute, however, has made some pretty bizarre or bold claims about a red heifer. For example, they said, but in truth, the fate of the entire world depends on the red heifer. For God has ordained that its ashes alone are the single missing ingredient for the reinstatement of biblical purity, and thereafter the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. Well, no, the Bible doesn't say that, but that's what they're claiming. And then Temple Institute also says, the Mishnah teaches that up to the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, ashes had been prepared from a total of only 9 red heifers. And so they're waiting to have a 10th one. He says, if there's been no red heifers for the past 2,000 years, perhaps it was the time was not right. Israel was far from being ready. But now, what could it mean for the times we live in to have the means for purification so close to hand? We cannot help but wonder and pray, for they're now red heifers. Is ours the error that will need them? So this is something that they believe, and they believe that this is going to be tied in with the return of the Messiah. I mentioned before about the fact is that Jews do not need a physical temple to do sacrifices. Some people have been misled by that. The book of Ezra, chapter 3. Let me read this because some people have been confused about this in terms of all this. So let's go to the book of Ezra, chapter 3, to read something about this. Verse 4, Ezra 3. They also kept the Feast of Tabernacles, it was written, and offered daily burnt offerings in the number required by the ordinance each day. Afterwards, they offered the burnt offering and those of the new moons, and for all the appointed feasts of the eternal that were consecrated, and for those who willingly offered a freewill offering to the Lord. Verse 6, from the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, although the foundation of the temple of the Lord had not been laid. So we see that the Jews or at least those associated with Ezra, who was a man of God, they were doing sacrifices, many sacrifices, and they didn't have a temple. And so the Jews do not have to have a temple in order to do this. Now, perhaps I should also mention that I confirmed this with the Sanhedrin years ago, that they can do animal sacrifices without it. Now, the stopping of animal sacrifices occurs just prior to the start of the Great Tribulation. And Jesus said, as I say to you all, watch, in Mark 13, verse 37. But let's go to the book of Mark. I want to go back up a few verses. Is the fate of the world dependent upon the Jews having a red heifer? Of course not. Do we need the ashes of a red heifer to purify us now? Of course not. Not as Christians. We realize that Jesus' sacrifice is sufficient. What's the fate of the world depend upon? It depends on God. Let's notice Jesus' words. Mark 13, starting in verse 19. For in those days there will be tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the creation, which God created until this time, no, nor shall ever be. So Jesus said there's a really bad time that's going to come. How bad is it? What's it going to take for intervention? Let's read the next verse. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened those days. So what we're seeing here, Jesus is saying the fate of the world is going to depend on the Lord intervening, not whether or not a red heifer is sacrificed. The Jews who don't accept the New Testament, don't accept the sacrifice of Jesus, are looking for something that's not necessary. Now, does it mean there will not possibly be a red heifer? No, there probably will be one, and they may use one, but it's certainly not a biblical requirement for the end time, and the fate of the world does not rely on a red heifer. The fate of the world relies upon the return of Jesus Christ, establishment of his kingdom, to stop the tribulation, the great day of the Lord. That's what we should be looking for, not just thinking that the fate of the world depends upon a cow called a red heifer. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel.